We're going to go a little faster on the second part here. We're going to get into um, component integration tests, otherwise known as just HTML testing. So component integration testing versus Protractor or end-to-end. Why would you pick one over the other? Historically, it's been Protractor, or if you know, before that it was WebDriver, before that it was Selenium, and the problem with those is that for us to be able to really test out an app using something like Protractor and really test out all the functionality and make sure everything really works, we have to create a lot of magic data. We have to have a lot of setup data so that, okay, now I got to find, an order that's past due over 60 days and has these other 3 flags as well. So I have to go create an order and I have to do all this crazy stuff, and then I got to go find it and load it up and then see if it actually responds the way that we expect. That's cumbersome, and frankly, it just doesn't work over time. What happens is we end up with, let's say 400 tests that start failing intermittently for really no real good reason. And Internet Explorer is honestly, that's the one that we would see the most. It would just randomly fail. The other really big problem with doing it this way with Protractor is that now what happens is you've got a group of tests that take 3 hours to run. No developer in their right mind is going to sit around for 3 hours and wait to see if those tests, passed. And if they failed, he's going to forget the fact that it was his check-in that probably caused it. No, it was probably Bob's over there. I'm sure he's the one that, failed it. So that's really the problem there is they take too long, a lot of magic data setup, versus if we think about component integration testing out the HTML, what if we can mock all the dependencies and we can create all the perfect scenarios so we can test how a component's going to react in the browser. So the basics around this is no magic data setup. We're going to mock and spy external calls to control the inputs. We're going to interact with HTML only. There's an asterisk next to that because there are some things that you're just going to have to interact with a component on, like the router, like a few other pieces. Depending on how your component's written, you may have to interact with it a little bit because it's the only way to really see whether or not something changed. However, the motto here is to interact with that as little as possible and really have everything be handled by the HTML and what a user would see. So, so we got a couple of new imports. One we already talked about, debug element. That's included in the standard tests that when we generate using the Angular CLI. So you have debug elements, you have native elements. Debug elements is kind of the wrapper around a native control, like a select or an input box or whatnot. So we bring that in so that we can strongly type our elements and we actually see what some of the functions are and just be strongly typed. Another big one here is in the platform browser is a thing called dispatch event. This helps us to communicate with Angular from the component, from the native element, and say, hey, I just got an update. So basically, from what my understanding is, and someone correct me if I'm wrong, however, it's basically recreating what the browser would be natively doing, is saying, hey, I just got there's a change on this. So, and the last one here is by. And this is used to do CSS selectors. And you can also select by directives and by bindings. There's a few different ones that you can use. However, in the past, what we'd often have to do is pull in jQuery or jQuery Lite, just so we could get some selectors. And then we'd make sure that hopefully the jQuery didn't get into our production build and bloat us by another, X amount for another entire framework. All right, so in the case here, most of our setup's still the same. The big piece here is we're going to select our controls. Now you can do this in individual tests. We prefer to, most forms, and especially we look at a form like this, I'm like, okay, look, I got 5 elements. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that are visible. And technically I got 6 and 7. However, key thing here is those don't actually exist. Like right now, they're gone, and I'm not able to select those because they're ngIf'd into the form. So I can attempt to select them now. However, they're null. There's nothing there. So let's see here. In our case here, we've got username element, password element, username error element, password error element. Those are all actually native native elements. To date, I have not found a type for a native element yet. And I think it's because they're all different. They all have different properties. I'm guessing inputs versus selects versus whatever. Here we've got a login button. That actually we want a debug element for. And then we have our login form. This is our form group. We want to get our username form control, which is an abstract control. These kind of bleed the line a little bit, and we'll talk about this in a second. In our case here on our before each, we're just going to go ahead and allow ng on init to fire, and then we're going to go ahead and select up all of our stuff. So I've got a reference now to my username, my password, and my primary button, which is the login. I go ahead and get my form, login form, and I go ahead and get the two controls off of that. And I do this because really this is another one of those exceptions, because I'm actually getting this off the component. However, there's no way for me to tell that it's invalid before I click the login button. And I want to check to make sure that it is invalid before we click it. So this is one of those kind of asterisk moments of this is the only way we could actually test it. So this one of the common gotchas is ngIf. If my control isn't there during the before each, it's going to be undefined, and in our case here, we're going to call native actually these are, yeah, we'd be calling native element on them, and they'd be blowing up on us because this part would be null. So all right, dispatch event. So we talked about this briefly. This is the browser utility that updates the form group with the new values. It alerts Angular, hey, something's changed on this input. The two most common that you're going to see is input and change. Input is for inputs, and then change would be anything like selects, checkbox, yeah, stuff like that. There's one of the ones that we came across was if anyone's using the Angular 2 Bootstrap components for like a date picker, change event is the one that you need to use to fire. Sometimes you just have to play around with it. The interesting thing here is when, let's say if you create a custom component that's got your own inputs in it, like you're going to have to remember to select not just your component, you got to select the component and the input inside your component and call the change event on that little guy so he'll update and cause the browser to alert that Angular should update. So dispatch event, gotcha. This is really common. So I have a drop down. I set a value to 2. I call the change event on it, and it's still invalid. Required is not, my drop down, is required message. The heck, I set a value. Well, I forgot to actually load my drop down element with options. So there's not an option with a value of 2, and so there's nothing I can set it to. Thus, it just goes, yeah, it's an invalid value. It's not meeting the requirement. Same on a date picker. We had somebody putting in dashes for the dates, and it's not the right format for it. So if it's not the right format, it rejects it. It doesn't see their actual value there, and it's kind of one of those crazy, like, why is it not accepting my value? Make sure it's in the right format. Make sure that you have especially if you're dynamically loading those, then you need to make sure that your mock that should be getting that data is feeding it to it so that it actually is going to have option elements in it. The bad part about this is that invalid or improperly formatted values will fail silently. And then you'll just get an error that, the required, is still not met. So, yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry, what? Because this would be like okay, this is Angular 2, so we don't have watches. Oh, okay. So that would go away. So maybe say it another way. Help.
Okay, let's make it another way. You've got one form field that has an on change based on the value of another form field changing.
Like another field, one field is dependent on another field.
Exactly.
Gotcha. So let's say you're using something like a service to be able to do component-to-component communication. Okay. In that case there, if you want to test that, that's really more would be covered in your, you have one or two options to test that. One, you test it in your unit test, and you would actually fire that same event so that it would bubble up into it and it would handle and do whatever it's going to do, right? In a integration, you wouldn't really be able to test it by itself and get it to bubble unless you force the event into it. You know, basically call the service directly and force it to bubble up. You could do it that way. However, again, that's not really interacting with the HTML. What you could do in that case is actually put two components down. Create a parent component. So often what you'll see in some of the tests is I can create right in my spec, I'll create a new component. And in there, I'll actually put HTML, drop down my 1 or 2, 3, 4 components, and that's the one I'm launching, and that's the one I'm building against. And then I can start to see, hey, does this actually happen? Because that would, naturally, as a user would see it, it would force it to happen. Yeah, go ahead.
For the test runners and things like that, can you test run on all of the browsers?
Yes, what we recommend is you can. Number one is it's going to come out. Most of them will set it up for Chrome. We highly recommend set it for Phantom. If it'll pass on Phantom, it'll pretty much pass on anything. Phantom tends to pick up a lot of the cross-browser issues. We came across one the other day where there is a polyfill for the date picker, something with the international date format. And not all browsers support the INTL object. Works great in Chrome. When we go and we push it up to Circle CI to actually have it kick off all the tests, it fails because it's headless, it's Phantom, and Phantom actually knows that this is an issue. So if you get your test to pass in Phantom, they'll pass with anything. Typically.
You want to be sure you saw slabs of browser stuff.
Yeah, there's another option there for you.
So you can run them through something like browser stack.
Yeah, you can run into actual browsers. And that's
Maybe that's the no for sure.
Yeah, that's the for sure. Yeah. I always start with Phantom. If you can get it to run in Phantom, you got a pretty good shot. You'd still, if you really want to know 100%, you got to test it on the browsers. So while you're doing these sort of tests, the console log, we haven't really talked about this. However, it's a great friend. You can console log some stuff out. Often what we're doing is I'll go select an element. So I'll get in here and I might say console log on username element after I set a value. I can see whether the value's been set. I can see, is it actually selected? What do I have there? It's quite useful. Without that information, it can be a little tough to kind of figure out what am I supposed to select, what am I supposed to do. So definitely use that. We often where we're using console log is when we don't really know how to test out a component yet. And so we'll start pulling in the HTML. How's it rendering out? What's going on there? How can we select it? And we kind of work through those issues. Let's see here. So router spy, again, we're going to use, we talked about this earlier, so we don't really need to cover that again. So one of the things that we haven't talked about is this thing called fixture when stable. So this here returns a promise. And the idea here is that once the fixture is actually stable, this is where I should really start doing any of my act. I can arrange anything that I want beforehand, because arrange is, hey, let me set up the variables, let me set up what it's going to need. However, when I start to act, I need to make sure that the component is ready and stable. We've played around with this. We've been able to take it out of there, and it still functions without it. It's highly recommended that you use it, though. I believe that in certain scenarios, that you could actually get the component and start working with it before it's fully stable and fully gone through its life cycle, especially if it's got something that's long running. So you want to make sure that you would use this. So in this case here, we pretty much wrap every single one of our integration tests with this. We go ahead and do our arrange, and then the first thing we do is fixture when stable. We want to make sure these tests are going to pass under any environment. So trigger event handler. So you may have noticed it back here. I have a button I call trigger event handler click. This again is a low level native, or actually this is on the debug element. So there's a thing called trigger event handler, and I can go ahead and fire off a click event, and I can pass values to that click event if I want to. So some events I could fire, click event I don't really have values to hand off. However, in the case that I need to call a change event and I need to then pass the new value or something of that nature, this allows me to do that. So this is the most common way to do click. You can also do on the debug element, you can call just click by itself. They don't recommend that as much. It is available. You can use it. And I'll show you an example here in a minute where we are using it because the other one doesn't work. For buttons, definitely trigger event handler works great. On anchor tags, not so much. So that was what we were seeing on that. All right, that's cool. I think that's it. So let's look at some tests here. All right, so we kind of covered here, we're selecting our elements. On the username and password, we're getting the native elements. On the login button and the forgot link, we're just getting the debug elements. So the first thing I want to do here is I want to, on our integration test, I want to check to make sure the form is invalid when nothing is set. So I've come in, we've already called detect changes, we've unraveled, we have a component that's ready to go. I don't have a visual way of knowing whether or not the form's valid or not. So in this case, we went ahead and just pulled in the user form control and checked to see if it has an error, should have required to be true, and the valid should be false, and the form should be false for valid. So it's the only way that we could get to it. Again, we want to limit these as much as possible, now, in our opinion. On the second test here is now I want to check and make sure that show validators, it should show the validators when it's invalid. So we're the same basic test, except for now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead and click the login button without setting anything. And then we go ahead and call detect changes. At that point, the ngIfs are going to fire, because what we have over here, just so you can see really quick, I'll have this is the code block that we're looking at here. Only show this if show errors is true. That gets set when we click the login button, and if login form controls password get error required is true. If it has both of those, then it'll go ahead and gen this out. This is the translate there. That's just translation stuff, and a little bit of classes for formatting. So in our case here, once we go ahead and click the button and we call detect changes to let it unravel, now we go ahead and get our user error element and our password error element. And then this is a situation I was looking at earlier. I was like, well, we were just setting them to be like this, so that password element would be truthy. I could find something that existed. That's okay. However, I was like, it'd be way better if I could find it and it had the correct validation message in it, username required. So this is where we started using console log and looking at first, started out with just this. Okay, what's in there? Okay, and then actually it looked like it had updated the type def for it recently, and so I actually found it had inner text, and now we could just get straight to that. So while I was putting this presentation together, one of the things I wanted to change is change inner text here to be password required. Again, these are just translation strings here that would get converted to real. So now we can go check and make sure, hey, does the validation pass or not? Now this validation example is really, really simple, just required or not. Obviously, if you had more stringent requirements, this has got to be an email, password's got to, meet this regex, and so on and so forth, then we'd want to test those things out as well and be able to do all of those. Let's see here. Form should be valid with proper values. So in this case here now, we're going to go ahead and set username element value with a username, and we're going to dispatch that event on that element. We're going to set the password, dispatch that event, call detect changes. And now what we want to do is check to make sure that the form is fully valid. That we have, the required has been met, that control is valid, same on the password, and that the overall form is valid. So next one we want to do here, very similar, is we want to make sure that it navigates the dashboard on a successful login. So in this case here, we're going to arrange, we're going to spy on the router, make sure that it doesn't actually attempt to navigate. Again, there's nowhere for it to navigate to. And then fixture, when stable, we're going to go ahead and set the username, dispatch the event, password, dispatch the event, click the login button and detect the changes. And we should expect that the router navigate to have been called with dashboard. Now in the case here, I could say, oh, well, let's check session token. Well, that's really the unit test. We don't need to do all this. We're really just checking to make sure, is it going where we want it to? This is the interactions that the user is going to have. If you have any question about what you should be testing, come back to your form. Come back to your page and look at it and go, okay, well, what can I do? Oh, well, there's also failure, right? So we can come back and write a failure one. So, you know, we skipped right over this. We'll cover this really quick. No, actually we did. We covered test utils failure. So we're going to replace this time our off-service login function with the test utils failure function. So now when login gets called, it's going to throw an error and blow up. In this case here, we want to see that the toast error to have been called. And we can even change it to be called with, and I think it's something like login error. And when we were looking at this stuff here, so okay, we've covered all the validation and if it blows up versus it does well, okay, great. What about if I want to go to account trouble? So you're not able to see, however, it should log or take us over to forgot password. So I want to test that out. So this is one I was actually doing tonight before you guys got here to see like, hey, can we test out a link? In this case, what I did is I came back over here on the link and I just put a class on it so I could find it. I attempted to get it to load by router link and I couldn't seem to get that to work and I was running out of time. So I went with a tried and tested CSS class and put forgot password on it. And so that's actually getting selected back up here. And so this was loading fine. And so when I initially started this out, I was actually using the trigger event handler, which actually would be on the debug element here, right? The trigger event handler, and attempting to get it to go that way. It wasn't working. It was actually blowing up with a really nasty error that it couldn't find the button and something. So I was like, all right, well, I remembered from reading some of the test stuff out on the Angular 2 site that I could call the click method directly. And I actually found that worked. And then with this here, I can go and expect that the router navigate by URL to have been called. I was attempting to do called with, however, it has a very complicated structure that it's creating and wasn't quite sure how to recreate that within the time period that I had. However, you can start to dig in. Again, these are things that you can console log on, figure out what the value is that it's setting and how you can recreate that and validate that, yes, it's actually working the way that you want. So,
so with this, how do you, if you wanted to say log what was actually called, how would you log basically what spy on is capturing? For navigate by URL, you said it's capturing the arguments being passed in.
That's a good question. I believe, well, the first thing I can do is actually just let it go. And if I run this test here, let's just run this really quick. Let's just say to have been called with ABC. And view, tool window, terminal. Oh, they're already running, and really using Command K on a Mac is really nice. It'll clear that window for you. Start with a nice, clean, fresh window, which is great when you're scrolling through pages of errors when things aren't working right. So expects by navigate by URL to have been called with ABC, but actual calls were nothing. Oh, actually, it's up here. And this is what was confusing, it's just /forgot. So it's not a string, it's an object. Not quite sure. what that actually translates to. So I could basically get the rest of it. It's then passing an object here. Skip location change false, replace URL false. Those are just standard flags, for the router piece. So this is really the piece to kind of figure out. Since we weren't able to figure that out right away, at least we can say, yes, it is calling the router deal, and we believe we're going to the right spot. Ideally, it'd be better to have it be what we want here. So again, though, it started out something like this. I don't think we can just, a lot of times what you can do is just take what they have. Yeah. Always fun on a trackpad.
Isn't slash forgot the URL and the button element itself?
It is. However, that's a string.
But that's part of the argument, is it not?
Yeah. What type is that?
The string. It's an argument.
That doesn't have quotes around it.
Oh, I guess not. Yeah.
That's what's tricky with this. I mean, I first looked, it's like, oh yeah, no problem, cool. Or hey, I'll just copy and put it in here. No.
Can you type in typo? Is there some way to find the typo of it?
It's.
You have to get the arguments from the spy object.
Yeah, exactly. I'd need to get the arguments there. I believe if you go look up Jasmine Spy, there's a way to actually get to those. Adam, do you know by chance? No? Let's talk to the gentleman behind you. For those of you who don't know Adam, that's Adam sitting back there. So, yeah, I believe there's a way with Jasmine you can actually look up what those specific arguments are, and you could type of on those, and you could figure it out. Sometimes it's a little complex to kind of figure out what it is that you want to compare against because it's passing over more stuff than what you think. I'm just doing a simple click event, on a link, and it seems all nice and cool until I attempt to get it to say that it should have been called with a specific value.
I just looked up. It's most recent call.var, and that will return an array of everything you need.
Most recent. All right, let's just check that out really quick. Thank you, Mr. Reed. ABC, and it's most.
It'll be the
router. Yeah, the
navigate spy.
Oh, got it. Okay, got it. Console.log. We'll let this rebuild. Hmm?
Just saving time with the F in front of that IT.
Oh yeah, we could fit it. Yeah, you're right. Undefined.
Wait, is that a function?
Is that a function? Well, the function, it should have printed out the function then if it was a function.
Yeah,
I assume there was function.
Most recent call.
CALL, not ED, right? All right. So anyway, there should be a way you can get to it. There's lots of documentation. We could spend an hour like looking it up and going through all the scenarios. Anyone else have another question?
What about router guards?
Router guards.
Yeah, like an auth guard on a route.
Gotcha. We haven't dug into that too much. We use it. We use an auth guard or a router guard on most of our production code. Testing that, I believe we test the guard itself. We haven't tested it directly with the route. I know if you go and do some stuff on Angular to testing routes, there's some stuff on this that you can, there's definitely some articles out there on it. We just haven't really gotten that far with it. And that's getting to be a little bit more of an integration test of, hey, my router and the auth guard together, and how are those playing, so I guess you could test the router by, that your router class and mock out your auth guard and then be able to make sure that's working. Haven't done a lot with that though. So. Well, if you mock both the router and the auth guard, what are you testing? Yeah. you could mock one or the other possibly. What you got, Reed?
Oh yeah, this is just a quick thing. I'm going back a little bit. thing I gave you was from Javelin 1.0. So, when looking up documentation, make sure you're on the right version. The 2.0 is calls.mostRecent.
Calls.mostRecent. All right. While we're taking question here, we'll calls most recent.
Calls.mostRecent.
Oh, look at that.
Okay, that should do it.
All right. So, should we do a fit here? So, any other questions? Or are we just waiting nervously for the results?
Yeah, we gotta know now.
All right. Oh, look at that. That seems like an awful lot. So we could basically wade through this and then determine that somewhere in here,
There should be an R. Yeah.
yeah, got it. Yeah, so it looks like, yeah, that's an array. So we should be able to do .args. You know, and often, you know, when we're doing this stuff, this is how we're getting to it. We're having to console log it and expose what's there until we can finally get it down to, okay, this is what I want. The more specific you can be on the test, the more reliable the test will be. If you put everything in, oh, was it just called? Hey, was router, you know, navigate called? Yeah, sure. Don't know where it went. Went somewhere. So the more specific, the more explicit you can be. Typically, what I find is that my tests are going to be a lot more durable. They're going to be a lot easier to maintain long term. So, all right. So now we're down to wow, URL tree, root, segments. So yeah, we could basically keep digging down and you know, get into the first argument here and so on and so forth. So, all right, unless there's any other questions, we're done. We were able to get to that second half in about a half an hour. So was that all pretty clear on the integration test? Awesome. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess this is kind of a broad question, but you know, I'm kind of coming here to figure out the right tool for the job. And I'm pretty proficient in Selenium already, so I see some of the benefits of using this. But since you sound like you've done Selenium and that type of stuff, what are some of the pros and cons of doing it this way versus using Selenium?
Well, so the Protractor was actually written based off the Selenium WebDriver framework.
Okay.
However, it's got ties back into the runtime loop or whatever they're calling it now, the stack there. So instead of having to do, you know, the bag on Selenium and WebDriver was, you know, we'd have like all these, we'd have an entire class laden with functions on how to wait for different things. You know, wait for this, wait for that, wait for this condition. Yeah, and then they never seem to really wait correctly. They kind of wait most of the time until you really need it, and then it doesn't wait. That's usually about 2 hours and 45 minutes into a 3-hour test block. You know, it stops waiting correctly. So really, like I was saying earlier, the disadvantage, and where we're using Protractor now, is just to do some end-to-end smoke tests. So what that looks like is, okay, I'm going to log in, I'm going to go to the dashboard, I'm going to click through a couple of links, and I'm going to hit the major pages and make sure that all my major components are all integrated and things look okay. What we would call a smoke test. I do a deployment. I'm not doing a regression test, man. I'm just getting on the server and going like, okay, can I log in? Can I go to the search? Yep. Can I just, yep. Okay, cool. Now can I click on a record? Yep, cool. I'm not editing. I'm not, you know, I'm just making sure the basics are there. We find that works the best because of all the magic data conditions. Otherwise, I've got to go set up all this magic data either beforehand or while I'm running the test, which make them run even longer because I first have to log in and then create the record that I want to go do, and then now go over to this other page so I can go search for it, find it, and now start my real test. Versus with these, what I can do is I can drop the exact component I want to test with or components, and I can inject the exact data that I want to work with to create that scenario so that I can make sure that it works. And these run fast. Those run slow.
Yeah.
It's, I mean, they're...
My fear is just like doing it on all computers. I know you said you can run them on computers,
you could either run them manually, for your own sanity checks. I think most people are doing is using Phantom.js to do their everyday, for all the check-ins. They're kicking off the builds that way. In the case of going to production or as we're going to stage, then we might, kick it off through Sauce Labs or one of those as a sanity check and make sure like, okay, look, we're still good to go. We're signing off on this release. However, typically you wouldn't be running those, I think, every time. However, it depends on your organization, like what works best for you.
Karma, you can run multiple browsers. So like you can run all your tests in like 3 different browsers on your local machine.
You can do that as well. There's also some other you can bring in stuff like browser sync and do some crazy stuff with that. Where literally you're only working on one browser and it's got 3 other browsers open and they're all doing the same thing you're doing.
Well, I mean, you're gonna leave out mobile devices unless you're using Sauce Labs or something like that, or browser stack.
Yeah, browser stack's fine. I just want to make sure.
Like those are great for like nightly runs, like if you want to run it overnight or something. But for the stuff that you run every check-in,
Sure.
it needs to be a lot faster.
Right. Just making sure we can run all of them like that without it being too much of a headache.
Yeah. Yep, you can do it. You can come right. What he was speaking about, it's right here in the Karma Conf. I can come down in here and I can say I want to run Phantom JS. I want to run Firefox, Opera, so on and so forth. As long as I have them installed, it'll run them. I also have to. There's a couple of things you have to do. You got to do some package installs. You've got to do a Karma, like here's the Chrome launcher. I'd need to install Phantom.js for here, and I'd need to also then install Karma Phantom launcher. Yep, go ahead.
How much control do you have over browser versions launch your file to your system?
I don't know. Good question.
Okay. So
Yeah. With these, it's what on these other platforms
With
that
Sauce Labs, you can pull up whatever. I mean, it goes away pretty far back, but you pay for that. So.
You can also run it inside a Docker container, which is what we have to do, because we have specific libraries that are dependent on Chrome from 2 years ago.
right.
And you can run IE browsers and VMs. You can download those, but then they do timeout and stuff, so for like 90 days or something.
Yeah.
So either you maintain it or you pay somebody like Sauce Labs.
Anyone else?